The morning the story broke, Washington buzzed like a hive. What started as a small headline on the Washington Post's front page soon erupted across every political outlet, news app, and primetime feed nationwide. The headline read, "Federal Judge Initiates Criminal Contempt Hearing Against Vice President JD Vance." The absurdity of it sounded almost surreal, but it was real and dangerous. Judge Malcolm Greer, a Clinton-era appointee known for his sharp demeanor and a reputation for partisanship disguised as propriety, had filed a legal motion against the sitting vice president. The charge? Willful obstruction of a federal ruling through executive influence. The accusation stemmed from a decision Vance had made 2 weeks earlier. He had publicly criticized a federal injunction that froze a rural energy development grant, a decision that disproportionately harmed low-income families in Appalachia. Greer had authored the injunction. In a fiery speech in Ohio, Vance had said, "If unelected judges want to strangle progress in places they've never set foot in, they should be prepared to defend that arrogance in daylight." That sentence set Washington on fire. Judge Greer called it incitement, and by Monday, Vance was ordered to appear in federal court under threat of contempt. A sitting vice president was about to defend himself on the stand. Reporters surrounded the White House steps. Pundits pounced. "This is a constitutional crisis," one anchor gasped. "No vice president in history has been threatened with contempt by the judiciary," said another. But JD Vance didn't flinch. He didn't tweet. He didn't call a press conference. Instead, he simply released a one-sentence statement. "If they want to put me on trial for defending forgotten Americans, I'll bring every one of them with me." And true to his word, when the day arrived, JD Vance didn't walk into that courtroom alone. He walked in with steelworkers from Kentucky, farmers from West Virginia, single mothers from Southern Ohio, coal miners in Union jackets, and veterans in wheelchairs. They didn't shout. They didn't protest. They just stood. In the front row of the federal courtroom, with cameras rolling, Judge Greer leaned over his bench, eyes burning with political fury, and pointed at the Vice President of the United States. "Mr. Vance," he thundered, "you are dangerously close to contempt." JD stood slowly, calm, unshaken. What he said next would echo through history. The room wasn't filled with elites in suits, but with working-class Americans who rarely saw the inside of federal buildings unless they were fixing the pipes. And they were silent, not out of fear, but reverence. They knew exactly why they were there. JD Vance wasn't just defending his right to speak. He was defending them. JD stood at the defense table, no attorney shielding him. He had refused legal counsel. "If this is about my words," he told the press the night before, "then they should hear them directly from my mouth." Judge Greer adjusted his glasses and slammed the gavel once. "Let the record reflect that the vice president has declined representation and will answer for his own conduct." The stenographer's keys clacked like gunfire. Greer wasted no time. "Mr. Vance," he began, his voice taut with restrained venom, "did you or did you not make a public statement insinuating that this court, my court, was acting against the interest of the American people?" JD Vance leaned toward the mic. "I didn't insinuate it, Your Honor. I said it directly." Gasps filled the room. Greer turned red. "You're under oath, Mr. Vice President." "So I'll be honest," JD replied. "Your ruling suspended infrastructure funds to rural counties that don't have broadband, clean water, or basic heat in the winter. You froze that. And when I spoke against it, you didn't challenge my facts. You challenged my right to speak." The courtroom pulsed with energy. Not rage, but recognition. Greer leaned forward, his voice low and poisonous. "You think you're above the law?" JD didn't blink. "No, Your Honor. I think I'm beneath the people. You forgot." That line detonated. Reporters furiously typed in the back. Cameramen readjusted lenses. Staffers whispered into their earpieces. They were witnessing something they hadn't seen in decades, a politician speaking without filter, without fear. Greer slammed his hand on the bench. "This isn't a campaign rally, this is a courtroom." JD didn't flinch. "The people behind me were sentenced to neglect long before I ever stood here." He stepped forward. "You want to jail me? Do it. Make history. Be the judge who tried to silence the vice president for defending the exact Americans this government claims to serve." He turned slightly, gesturing to the front row, grizzled miners, teary-eyed veterans, mothers with children in their laps. "But understand what happens next. When you raise the gavel against me, you strike them too." For a moment, the entire room hovered in the eye of the storm. Then, Judge Greer reached for the contempt order. A uniformed officer stepped forward, and the oxygen in the room seemed to leave. JD Vance stood there, not ready to be arrested, but ready to become a symbol. The judge's hand hovered over the contempt order for a moment. History teetered on a page. Then he signed it. Federal order. Contempt of court. A sitting vice president charged for defending citizens with a microphone instead of silence. Gasps broke out. Not from the press gallery, but from the people behind JD Vance. These weren't political staffers. They were the forgotten ones, the ones who'd only ever been in courtrooms as defendants, witnesses, or mourners. And now, the second highest elected official in America was being punished for standing up for them. The bailiff approached. A heavy silence fell over the crowd. JD Vance didn't flinch. He unclipped his watch, removed his jacket, and laid it calmly on the defense table. When the officer reached for his wrist, JD raised his head, not in defiance, but in dignity. "I took an oath," he said loud enough for every camera, mic, and American ear tuned in to hear, "to defend the Constitution, not to obey intimidation." He looked directly at Judge Greer. "You wanted to shame me, but all you did was expose yourself." Then the handcuffs clicked. The image flashed across every feed, every headline, every screen in America. A vice president in cuffs, not for corruption, not for scandal, but for telling the truth about power. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted, not in violence, but in applause. The sound was so thunderous it shook the pavement. People who had never clapped for a politician in their lives cheered, as though they had just watched a man step into fire and walk out clean. The motorcade didn't drive him back to the White House. It took him to holding. But when JD stepped into that concrete cell, he did it like a man who knew exactly what he was doing. He didn't lower his head. He didn't shout for lawyers. He sat on the edge of the bench, looked at the camera in the corner, and said, "Film all of it. The American people deserve to see what happens when their leaders refuse to kneel." Outside, the crowd doubled. Veterans in wheelchairs, mothers holding flags, truckers leaning on their rigs, farmers from 2 counties over, miners who hadn't spoken in public in 10 years. One woman raised a cardboard sign, handwritten and shaking in her hands. "If he's in jail, we're all guilty." Another sign read, "He spoke for us, now we speak for him." And slowly, across the country, something began to rise. Not outrage, but a movement. The footage of JD Vance in handcuffs reached America before he even reached holding. By noon, the image had been shared 30 million times. By 3 p.m., it was on the front page of every outlet: CNN, Fox, The Atlantic, The Daily Caller. It wasn't a scandal. It wasn't a gaffe. It was a simple, staggering fact. The vice president was jailed for defending the voiceless, and the country did something it hadn't done in years. It united. In Pennsylvania, retired coal miners gathered outside the Capitol with picket signs, not demanding money, but answers. In Mississippi, a Baptist preacher ended his sermon by quoting JD's courtroom words verbatim. Spontaneous rallies erupted in Boise, Denver, Mobile, and Cleveland. No party banners, no consultants, no media handlers, just Americans who saw the second highest office in the land weaponized against a man for standing with the lowest. Inside the White House, President Trump watched the news in silence. then turned to his chief of staff and said simply, "That boy just made history. Call the DOJ. This ends today."